This conversation is about understanding what data and evidence tell us on effective ways of networking. Oftentimes, we find informal advice, such as work the room or talk to everybody, at the moment of understanding and knowing how to network effectively. But few times we have a data-based perspective on the matter. A conversation with Dr. Javier Mejia, a political scientist affiliated with Stanford Political Science Department, was interesting because in his research, he studies how networking was a key factor behind Colombia's industrialization. His research, beyond the economic analysis of networks, highlights several interesting concepts in data science, but also it gives us practical insights on how to network. I hope you find this chapter interesting. See you soon.
I'm thrilled to be here with Javier Mejia. He is a researcher that works at an intersection between networks, entrepreneurship. He is also a lecturer here at Stanford, and he's an economist with a long trajectory studying the roots of entrepreneurship, among other important attributes of political systems. He has also lectured at NYU Abu Dhabi, at Bordeaux University, and currently writes at Forbes and other outlets in Colombia and the United States. Welcome, Dr. Javier. How are you doing? Did I miss anything?
No, not at all. That's a very comprehensive summary of what I've done. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm very excited of being here with you, David.
Awesome. I got super interested in your empirical research on the roots of industrialization in Antioquia. And I think the data strategies that you use, but also the practical insights on networking, I think are useful for anybody interested in data or not. I would like to start our conversation with the following. We have all these events where people attend, like you have 100 people, and I always get a little bit overwhelmed thinking, how should I network here? Right. So my take is go always where the foot is, and then you will have a good point to connect with people, but maybe that's not the most efficient. I would like to ask you from an evidence-based perspective, what do we mean by networks and what is the best way of networking?
That's a very good question because it's very prevalent in not only the academic, but also the corporate world. You are aware that your network is valuable and you want to optimize it, but no one really teaches you how to do that. Unfortunately, we don't have great specific evidence that would give concrete guidelines, partly because of the challenges that come from networks. Networks are a very complicated subject because everything is interconnected. There are a bunch of empirical challenges that come with studying networks. We don't have great insights of what is the best way of doing networking, but if you put together different pieces of lessons on the literature, I think there are a few points that might be useful and that I actually use at a personal level when I try to connect with people. Probably the most important one is to avoid a too strategic approach to networking. And the main reason for this is that the benefits of your social network are very hard to predict. So what connections do for you, it's not trivial to foresee. So maybe what you want from your network is to access funding to your startup if you're in the entrepreneurial world. But maybe what you get is advice. It's very hard to control because people can offer you what they can offer you. Or a lot of the ways in which the network is beneficial to you is not through your direct connection with someone, but through the connections of these people with other people. So if you get in touch with someone that you expect to give you advice, for instance, and expect this person to be your mentor, maybe this person is connected to someone that can give you capital. Or maybe he's connected or she's connected to someone that can give you capital or could connect you to a supplier, right? The different scales that open the network logic makes it very hard for you to anticipate what you can receive from a specific connection. And following that logic, it is naive to think that someone has a certain potential and that you should focus your attention in this person to exploit that potential because you're really not quite aware of what that potential is. My suggestion in general, and this is the first sort of good practices, try to avoid what ends up becoming a very utilitarian way of approaching social interactions, which is to think, oh, this person, a venture capital firm, and then they can fund my startup. That's why I want to talk to this person. Instead of that, try to be open to interact with people that you don't know exactly what they can do for you. You don't know why they want to chat with you, but try to be useful for this person. And this would be the second good principle. Try to think less about what you can extract from others, because there's a lot of uncertainty behind that. Instead, try to think about what you can offer them. If you think about long-term interactions that can support the transfer of resources or relevant information, reciprocity is an essential element, right?
Right.
And usually you build that from a perspective of trying to help instead of just aiming to receive help. So I guess two good first principles are those, right? Try to be less strategic, expecting that you can identify those people that have what you need and you're going to extract those from them. And second, trying to be helpful and valuable for others. In the long term, I think those two principles could be good ways of making a strong and useful network in the long term.
It sounds very insightful. Let me synthesize what you just said. So basically, we have two approaches, right? One that is more utilitarian, the business style of connecting with others, which is, oh, I connect because this person has this position at Facebook or whatever. I'm expecting a gain because of this involvement of this person in these companies. But what you're saying is, given that there is some uncertainty, you should not focus on this rational, strategic way. Rather, you should diversify, given that you don't know what will happen in the future. And also, you say something that I heard from venture capitalists, which is like, you have so much to offer that you can cultivate a long-term relationship. I totally agree with both of your insights. In your last paper, Social Networks in Elite Entrepreneurship in Latin America, you studied the case of Antioquia. And maybe our audience is not familiar with the beautiful regions of our country, Colombia, but I would like to ask you about how you got interested in intersection between entrepreneurship, networks, and why Antioquia is a relevant case for everyone who wants to network better in the business or in a personal setting. How do you get to that idea of writing a paper about Antioquia?
So the personal story of my interest for Antioquia is not particularly appealing in the sense that I'm from the region. I was aware of the context. I had advantages to work on that specific topic. However, the entrepreneurial environment of Antioquia is quite unique. This is not just for Colombian standards, but for international standards. Many people are not aware of this, but Antioquia, which is this region in the mountains in Colombia, was for the longest time quite disconnected from the rest of the world and was a rather backward region during colonial times. Think about this for the entire 16th, 17th, and 18th century. A rather remote area, somewhat poor. It had a mining tradition, but it was perceived as this backward region. However, this region during the late 19th century and early 20th century became the leader of industrialization in Colombia, one of the leaders in Latin America. It had an industrialization process with very specific attributes that made it different from other industrial poles in America. It was a region that industrialized because of the endeavors of its local elite. In contrast to what happened in Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo or Monterrey, it didn't have an industrial sector that emerged because of the influence of migrants or the arrival of foreign companies. It was an entire sector that emerged from companies that were founded by their locals.
Right.
And so it's a region with a very atypical presence of entrepreneurs. This has been recognized for the longest time. There's entire literature on the region. One of the things to identify is that the community was somewhat different. The network seemed to have been important. Everyone would talk about how cohesive this community was. By this community, I mean these elite that eventually created the industrial firms that would lead to industrialization. When I'm talking about industries, I'm talking about manufacturing companies, firms that were at the frontier of technological knowledge at the moment. This would be today creating the tech startups or the AI startups. That was the type of thing happening in this region in the late 19th century. These elite before this moment were used to own business of different types, but most of them were in traditional sectors. They had companies in mining, husbandry, agriculture, but creating a textile factory, a chemical products or a food processing company was a rather revolutionary activity. What I do in the paper is ask myself, well, what was the role of the connections that these people had? Did their structure of their network matter at all? And the answer is that it did, but not in a trivial way. And I guess we will have time to talk more about that, right?
That's so interesting because usually when you analyze the topic of entrepreneurship, you go directly to the financial causes or the economic causes at rearranging the economic factors. An interesting perspective is to analyze how the community characteristics and the personal characteristics of the entrepreneur organizing context. In your research, you highlight two crucial attributes of an entrepreneur's network that impact their success. One is the cohesiveness of their immediate network. And another one is the importance of this cohesiveness as this person to bridge several parts of the network. Will you tell us a little bit more about these two key concepts?
Yeah, so what I tried to do there is bring some order to this idea that networks matter, right? But then what type of networks are the ones that matter? Local connectivity that you describe very well as how cohesive your network is at local level. So how many of your connections are connected to each other. This represents how dense your immediate community is, right? And you could argue that someone that has a very cohesive community, that it's part of a fraternity, for instance, it's very well connected in a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's different from being well connected from a different perspective, which is to be able to connect different parts of the network. This is what I call global connectivity in contrast to local connectivity. And this global connectivity departs from the assumption that real life networks are a group of tribes. Most real life networks are settings in which people are part of cohesive groups. You can see this in the academic environment as department. People in each department know very well their colleagues, but they don't interact regularly with those in other departments. And the same thing happens in the corporate world. Those in the marketing department don't talk regularly with those in the selling department or the design department. Being well connected from a global perspective is to be able to bridge those different tribes. There are several reasons why that can be profitable. If you are able to connect these different groups, you are the person knowing what they all are doing. Within each of these groups, there are different ideas flowing, there are different resources available, and only you as the bridge connecting those, but also you're able to bring them together and create new things with those. So both things represent a certain notion of being well connected, but they make reference to very different things.
Always in a party, there is somebody who talks to everybody. And that makes me think with this current political division and polarization, the type of people who are connecting diverse tribes are less frequent. Do you agree with this?
This is a figure that has been well studied in the literature, mostly on sociology and on social networks. They usually call these individuals the brokers, right? And they're fairly rare for several reasons. Probably the most important one is that accessing each of these groups, each of these tribes is very expensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to know the codes, you need to know the language, the manners, and you need to be appreciated by each of the groups. And each of the groups have different requirements and codes. So it's very hard to master that. And it's very hard just to have the ability of doing it. So in the context that you describe of ideological polarization, it's very hard to be well received in a fully liberal environment and a very conservative one, right? That's actually a very good analogy. That's why it's fairly rare that those individuals exist. But there are some of those, and there's some literature on psychology that explores what specific cognitive features and personality traits you should have to be able to do that successfully. But what we do know, and this is probably exactly because they're fairly rare, those people that are able to do that seem to be well rewarded by organizations and the market, right? And the main finding of my paper goes in that direction, right? So it is exactly those individuals, the bridges, those that were well connected at global level, the ones that were more likely entrepreneurs in this setting.
That's a call for everyone thinking on becoming an entrepreneur with fast success or more likely success, that they have to learn how to talk to different parties. And often we assume that talking to different parties means just being social, but it means more. You need to understand the jargon. You need to understand the customs. You need to understand a bunch of things that take a lot of mental awareness, social awareness, and exposure. One of the things that impressed me about your research is the diversity standpoint. Oftentimes, every time I talk to entrepreneurs, when I use the word diversity, they often bring forward arguments of efficiency. Like, why am I interested in why I will be interested in diversity if that can endanger efficiency? I care more about people that are good at performing certain tasks or are efficient at doing something. Why the diversity matters in this context of networking and increasing your success?
That's a very good question. Very relevant for the public conversation we're having today, where a lot of it is on diversity. An important element to consider is that the concept of diversity has been captured by a specific ideological narrative, diversity in attributes, gender, racial terms, and so on. From that perspective, you could bump into efficiency problems. But in the context we're talking about, diversity really means being part of different social spheres. It doesn't matter the attributes of those people. They can be homogeneous from an observational point of view, but the important part is that they belong to different social spheres, to different tribes. Why is it useful to build a network where you're able to connect these different tribes? Each of these connections then is going to be part of this different tribe that is going to have different resources, different information than the one you're having or these others are having, right? Thanks to that, you can solve many of the challenges you face from an entrepreneurial point of view. Building industrial companies was very complicated. It was not enough to have the capital to create the firm. You had to import the machinery from Europe, hire the engineers, train the workers, and none of this was available at a local level. You couldn't use the market to get access to this. There were no universities that graduated engineers. There was no Amazon where you could look for the machines you need and just order them. You had to know people to access those resources, and each group had the ability to provide some resources, but no single group had the capacity to give you all the resources, right? So in order to bring the machinery, you had to be connected with the merchants that were used to bring pianos to this region. You had to be connected with the miners that had been importing engineers from Europe to work in the mines. And you had to be connected with the clergy because they knew how to deal with the masses and would be good at guiding and training workers. Diversity was essential in order to have access to resources spread out across the network and not available locally. It is particularly important in an environment where markets don't function well or have not yet developed for the needs you have. This is relevant for context even today. Usually what being an entrepreneur means is to create stuff that do not exist yet. And in those specific type of tasks, it's precisely where you need to have this diverse network that would allow you to build solutions that do not yet exist.
That makes total sense. And maybe this is connected to what I'm going to ask you. Like in your research, you use unexpected deaths of these entrepreneurs as a way of studying how the network changes in its structure. I feel this diversity aspect helps you leverage capacities that you don't have, but also helps you deal with unexpected changes. For example, your best friend, your founder, your mentor die. What are you going to do next? You need to find a next mentor, founder, whatever. How this identification strategy of choosing deaths as an exogenous factor help you understand better these changes, and what insights you brought from this identification strategy?
All of your questions are very good. So certainly that's an identification strategy. My approach to it was very technical. What I really wanted was an exogenous shock that would give me variations in the connectivity of individuals that were not correlated with the other things I had in mind. One of the things I learned was that indeed your network position, in particular your connectivity at global level, is very sensitive to small changes in the network. You don't need someone dying in your neighborhood for your position in the network to change significantly, right? Because someone dying on the other side of the network is reshaping all the paths that connect the network. Suddenly, you can easily be more central or less central. And I think that's a beautiful takeaway of how society operates, regardless of how independent we think we are. We're not really, we're all in the same boat. If something happens that's going to to affect you. I really like the approach you take in terms of how you interpret the consequences in the long term of changes in the network. This is something that the fully utilitarian and strategic approach to networking regularly ignores. The idea that the network evolves and building a robust network requires you to be aware of that and trying to think that it should survive the different type of shocks that could experience. And you described something that is very dramatic. Someone close to you died. I've experienced that. One of my mentors died during the pandemic. It was a tragic situation on a personal level and important for my career. But that doesn't need to be the case for your network to be heard by things. Prestige changes, and people sometimes forget about this, right? Whoever is the high prestige individual in a given moment, in a few years is frequently replaced by other people, right? A fully utilitarian strategic approach of looking for the highest status person in the room, make a connection with this person is probably optimal from a static point of view, but not from a dynamic point of view, right? Tomorrow, that person probably will no longer be the highest prestige person in the room. And there's this other person that you neglected because you wanted to chat with this high prestige person. Maybe now he's your peer, but tomorrow he's going to be the CEO of the company, right? It's very useful to be aware that the network changes over time, and building a diverse set of connections is probably a better strategy.
That's a beautiful reflection on how connected we are, regardless of how different we might look, regardless of what we want to achieve. Be a good person. Being a good person cultivates, it spreads good things across different people, and that could be a good strategy for the future.
And I'm an economic historian. I pay a lot of attention to popular knowledge and ancestral knowledge. And being a good guy and well-intended, it's something that we've known. It's a good approach forever, right? It's part of the popular knowledge of every culture for centuries. It's not just because people are naive and they love romantic approaches to life. It's because it has proven to be, through generations, a more resilient strategy. I think it's very reasonable from a fully rational perspective also.
I agree. One of the reasons why I get interested in measuring something so difficult such as networking is because everyone talks about networking well, but when everyone talks in such a loose manner, you feel that there is no concrete ways of improving, right? Which is different from what you are bringing here, which is creating metrics that allows you as an entrepreneur or as a person to see opportunities for improvement. I want to ask you precisely about the metrics part. You develop two metrics, which is the betweenness centrality and how that is important for entrepreneurs to take decisions in terms of business strategy. Could you tell us a little bit more about this betweenness centrality?
Yeah, so this is a concept that I didn't come up with. It is a metric that has been in the literature for a very long time. It's a very popular centrality measure that captures how important you are as a bridge in the network of the paths that connect nodes. So if you want to reach Bill Gates, how many times a third person is in those paths that connect you to Bill Gates? Some people are more important. Usually this is interpreted as a way of capturing how someone can be important even if they don't have many connections. You don't need to have many connections in order to be important. It measures your capacity to bring together groups and combine the things that are between those groups.
Yeah, our usual proxy when people add you in LinkedIn is looking at how well connected you are. But under this perspective, a more data-driven perspective, it doesn't matter how many connections you have. You just need to have one good connection that might be central over time, as you mentioned, like somebody die or somebody becomes more powerful, and that person that you thought it was low connected, no central, ends up being the bridge for a huge business opportunity.
Yeah,
right.
This is actually a very active question in the literature. How good are people to map their own network? Network scientists frequently do surveys or they collect data depending on what methods they use, and then they see the network. And the big question, and then they ask questions and they have metrics about the structure of the network. But if people actually see the network, there are different results in the literature. The best of our knowledge today is that people are fairly good thinking if someone is more or less connected, but they cannot map the entire thing. So they're fairly good knowing how popular you are, but they're not very good with these more subtle notions of centrality. So that's another additional element to avoid these very strategic approaches to networking, because you're not really sure who's the important person in these more subtle ways of centrality.
Thinking of all these factors, I wonder if there is a differential approach for startups and established firms in terms of networking. Does the importance of being network bridge vary between startups and more established firms? Or do you think this principle that you just shared with us based on your research apply for both?
No, I can actually tell you about this from another paper of mine that studies the same context but deals with banks. This is late 19th century. Banks were fairly conventional businesses. And there, what you see is that if you wanted to be a successful banker, the betweenness centrality was not very important. This whole story about being a bridge was not really going to make much of a difference for you as a banker. What really mattered was the number of connections you had. What's the logic here? While making one of these industrial firms require you to gather resources that were very different and spread out across the network, being a good banker was really about knowing enough people that would give you the opportunity to put money into one of these companies. A successful bank was able to gather enough capital and get into fairly decent businesses. For that, you really want to have many connections, people that could trust you to give you the opportunity to invest in the right assets at the right time. We don't find any relevant result with this local connectivity. Most of the channels in the paper on industrial entrepreneurship come from the global connectivity story. That doesn't mean that local connectivity is not important. It seems to be useful for other things. So if you want to make something new, something that is not on the traditional roads where there are institutions that regulate how to behave, in those places where you need to be a pioneer, having this diverse network and highly global centrality is very important. But if you're in an environment where things are better established, local connectivity matters a lot. This is the environment where it's useful to have people that can support you and deal with the problems of collective action, and they can operate as an insurance substitute when deal with the problems of environments where contracts are challenging to implement, environments where you need trust and solving coordination problems that are probably the regular type of challenges that well-established businesses face. In those contexts, local connectivity is probably more important. So knowing more people that are connected to each other, being part of local cohesive networks, in those settings, those type of network attributes are more relevant.
That reminds me to Lehman Brothers back in 2008. And somebody explained to me that the financial crisis that started with the implosion of one of these firms started with what you mentioned, that this bank didn't have anyone vouch and could solve a huge coordination problem, a huge financial problem. There is a trade-off when you diversify so much. You don't establish the roots that will vouch for you or solve emerging problems. I would like to focus my last two questions, and I'm really thankful for your time, on for data scientists. Like I'm passionate about data. And I would like to ask you, what resources or what topics should we pay attention to understand and leverage information from networks? From where we should start? I'm very focused on causal inference. So could you give me something to follow that can help me understand better networks and their value?
For the longest time, capturing network interactions was extremely difficult because they're not supervised or don't tend to be recorded. They're frequently very unstructured. So it was very hard to get data on networks. However, this has changed a lot with the internet. You have digital social networks that are all about that, and then you have that information who's connected with whom. Although accessing that information has become increasingly hard because of privacy reasons, there's still a lot of that. And depending on your connections with the corporate world, you can use some of that. So now we have a lot of data on connections. I was talking about the map of the network. It's fairly easy to get a network of that type and ask questions about the structure of the network, right? The type of questions we've been talking about here. However, I think that where the interesting questions in networks are now are not on the structure of the network, but on the features of the interactions. I think that because we have much more data now, it is not that interesting to know that there's a connection, but what happens in that connection. So if you think about this as roads, what are the attributes of those roads? How many cars flow from one road to the other per second? What type of cars these are? What are they taking? What I mean by this is between two people, what's the type of interaction that they have? What type of information they exchange? How do they treat each other? What type of emotions support those connections? All those dimensions about the features and attributes of the connections, I think are super interesting. There's not plenty of data, but there are things that can be used. If you look at interactions online and try to extract textual information. So what type of words people are using, it's the content of the messages that, and this with the AI is suddenly something that can be exploited more systematically, right? To understand what are the things that people are saying. It's something that now suddenly is probably something we can do. For the longest time, this was extremely difficult. So someone with a data-oriented mind probably could do great things in that dimension. Something that I also think it's an interesting set of questions, and this might be harder to implement, but it's feasible. And I'm working on something similar for a historical perspective, forecasting connections, right? Most of what we've done is trying to understand how people interact once they have connections. But it's very useful to foresee which connections are feasible in the future. This is something that people in the dating business were interested in. What's the likelihood that two people, if you bring them together, would form a connection? What type of connection would form? How robust this connection would be? It's an interesting question, and probably now we can exploit all this existing data on connections to do forecasting. The paper I'm working on is on a historical perspective. We follow people during the Middle Ages in these small villages in Spain, and then we have information of their great grandchildren and see if they have connections in the present. We try to explore if ancestral connections could tell you something about current connections. What are the determinants of future connections? There's data out there that can be used for those purposes.
So I got my attention into, among all the useful things, you said that instead of paying attention to the structure of the network, something that it results more interesting right now because of the availability of the data is paying attention to the features and idiosyncratic properties. You say something very interesting, which is forecasting connections. And for example, for a company of Tinder that will be much interested in this, I believe that, probably can correct me, having the ability to connect and define a path for poverty or for prosperity. Most of the social programs are centered on the material means. Like if you have employment, you can earn a wage, but not focus on how a person that is poor is probably poor because it's isolated, and it's isolated because of structural causes. So if you can forecast that, you can target in a better way these people, better social programs that specifically focus on the social aspect of these people.
Your intuition about how this conversation focusing on business objectives can have larger scale purposes, right? Many of the big social concerns that we have regarding inequality and segregation are fundamentally questions about the network structure, who's spending time with whom. Using data to think about that more carefully has huge potential for understanding the problem or for coming up with strategies that can impact the network and lead us to something more appropriate. This can take many shapes. Urban design, for instance, how we structure our spaces, people that frequently wouldn't interact now somehow interact under new conditions, or educational policies. So how we structure the classrooms, again, people that traditionally wouldn't interact would interact, or how do we avoid conflict in environments where we're aware that people would build tensions? How can we design environments where those tensions can be contained? This is some of the dimensions in which these ideas can be implemented. People like you that have this research oriented mindset that pay a lot of attention to what data can do are probably the right people to engage with this type of problems.
Dr. Javier, this has been a really useful and full of knowledge conversation, and I appreciate your time. Hopefully we can talk in the future about a topic that I think is central if you want to be an entrepreneur or a person with good career perspectives. Thank you so much, and see you later.
Thank you.